This lecture will provide a deeper look at the different techniques that are covered by the ATT&CK framework and the potential gaps in it. You will understand the different techniques and their applicability to different environments. We will focus specifically on cloud, Windows, macOS, mobile, and network frameworks, as well as cover the techniques in each, starting with the techniques in the cloud framework. A deep dive into the techniques in the cloud framework. As we mentioned previously, the MITRE ATT&CK framework has different matrices for the different enterprises, one of those enterprises being the cloud. While this is great, you have to remember that you may have to customize any techniques so that they fit your specific cloud environment. There are currently cloud matrices for Office 365, Azure AD, Google Workspace, Software as a Service, and Infrastructure as a Service. In this section, we will start by looking at the tactics that are covered and the unique techniques before discussing the sub-techniques and supplemental information. We'll start at the top by discussing the generic cloud enterprise matrix seen here. Initial access has 5 techniques. Execution has 5 techniques. Persistence has 7 techniques. Privilege escalation has 5 techniques. Defense evasion has 12 techniques. Credential access has 11 techniques. Discovery has 14 techniques. Lateral movement has 5 techniques. Collection has 5 techniques. Exfiltration has 3 techniques. And impact has 9 techniques. From looking at the generic cloud matrix, there are a few observations. The first observation is that not all tactics that are listed as possible options in the MITRE are used. That shows that the tactics listed in each matrix might vary slightly depending on the applicability to the infrastructure that is being examined. The second observation is that there are some techniques that fall into multiple tactics. For example, you see that valid accounts is in initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, and defense evasion, which shows that techniques have a one-to-many relationship with tactics. When in the matrix, you can take a deeper look and show sub-techniques and subsequent details. For example, in the technique of account manipulation under the persistence tactic, there are 6 sub-techniques. The 6 sub-techniques are as follows. 1. Additional cloud credentials. This can occur when an attacker creates or adds accounts to be able to maintain persistence. 2. Additional email delegate permissions. This occurs when an attacker grants themselves or delegates folder or mailbox privileges that can be used to maintain persistence or for business email compromise. 3. Additional cloud roles. This is where an attacker adds user roles in order to maintain persistence or assign the role to a compromised user to elevate privileges. 4. SSH authorized keys. Secure Shell or SSH is a network protocol used for encrypting network traffic over unsecured networks. This sub-technique is where an attacker would either compromise legitimate SSH authorized keys or add new SSH keys to maintain persistence and have possible root access. 5. Device registration. This is where an attacker would add a device to comply with an organization's multi-factor authentication protocol and help maintain access. 6. Additional container cluster roles. This is where an adversary may add additional roles or permissions to a malicious account to maintain persistent access to a container orchestration system. In the details of the technique and sub-technique, you are provided with a detailed description of the technique, procedure, examples, mitigations, detections, and references. Account manipulation is when a malicious user modifies credentials, roles, and so on in order to potentially elevate their privileges or carry out other nefarious activities. In this case, the attacker must already have some level of access to conduct an attack, such as social engineering to gain access to a legitimate account. Procedural examples are cases where known hacker groups have used these techniques in one of their hacks. And for this technique, one example is that of APT3, which has used account modification to add accounts to the local admin groups so that they have root-level privileges. APT3 is a China-based advanced persistent threat group. APT groups are sophisticated, typically state-sponsored hacker groups. Some steps that can be taken for mitigation of the risk of account modification are to enable multi-factor authentication and implement privileged account management to ensure that only members that absolutely need admin privileges have it. Essentially, it's implementing the principle of least privilege. Some methods for monitoring would be to monitor the log files on file modification, such as the authorized keys file for each use, or monitoring locations for logins and accepted multi-factor authentication pushes. Next, we'll turn our attention to the Office 365 matrix. The Office 365 matrix. Office 365 is a line of business tools from Microsoft, such as Outlook and Microsoft Word, that are used online to allow work to be conducted in a collaborative manner, and is a software as a service offering. Office 365 has over 345 million paid users, so naturally it is a popular tool, which makes it a large target for hacker groups. This is why you would want to ensure monitoring is put in place that aligns with the matrix. The matrix for Office 365 cover the tactics seen here. Initial access has 3 techniques. Execution has 2 techniques. Persistence has 6 techniques. Privilege escalation has 4 techniques. Defense evasion has 8 techniques. Credential access has 7 techniques. Discovery has 4 techniques. Lateral movement has 3 techniques. Collection has 3 techniques. Exfiltration has 3 techniques. And impact has 4 techniques. As you can see from the Office 365 matrix, it has far fewer techniques than the generic cloud matrix because it is specific only to Office 365. If we were to analyze one technique in this matrix, we can start with Office application startup in the persistence tactic. We chose that technique because it will only show up on the Office 365 board and none of the other cloud boards. It will show on the generic cloud matrix because the matrix has all the techniques across all the specific matrices. The Office application startup technique contains 6 sub-techniques. 1. Office template macros. Macros are small packages of code that can be used to carry out an action. An attacker can add a malicious macro, inject code into an existing macro to obtain or maintain persistence on an account. 2. Office test. The Office test registry key is a common target for attackers because that registry allows you to set a random dynamic link library, or DLL. This is code that can be used by multiple programs at the same time and can execute every single time an Office application is started. 3. Office forms. These are templates used in various Office applications and can be compromised via malicious form being uploaded and automatically loaded when an Office application is started. 4. Outlook homepage. This is a legacy feature within Office, which means that it is backwards compatible with older versions of Office. It allows a user to customize the appearance of a folder and can be compromised through code injection and remote code execution, which could execute when the compromised folder is clicked on. 5. Outlook rules. These are conditions put on your Outlook inbox that can set up filtering, forwarding, and automatic replies. An attack would compromise these by creating a malicious Outlook rule that would be executed when the attack sends a specific email to execute the rule. 6. Add-ins. These include the ability to add features to your individual Office programs, such as Word or Excel. These can be compromised by an attacker injecting code into a few different libraries, then remotely executing the code and maintaining persistence on the account. The description of this technique shows sub-techniques with a variety of ways that Office 365 can be abused by malicious users, especially because it is a common target. One of the procedural examples of the technique is that APT32, an APT group based out of Vietnam, has replaced Microsoft Outlook's VBA-Profect.otm file to install a backdoor macro to maintain persistence on someone's account. Steps for mitigation are to enable the attack surface reduction rules on Windows 10 machines, to disable Office VBA macros from executing, and to always update your software, amongst other steps. For detection, it is recommended that you implement monitoring on your application logs, specifically around third parties that are leveraging Microsoft Office, and monitor for newly constructed files that may leverage the application startup features. Typically, when you're using Office 365, you're also using Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD, for account and account permissions management, which we will cover next. Azure Active Directory. Active Directory is a database that connects users with respective resources or permissions that are needed to get their work completed. Active Directory is one form of account management, and there are over 1 billion users in Azure AD currently, which makes it an obvious target for monitoring as part of your security best practices. The Azure AD matrix comprises the tactics and techniques seen here. Initial access has 1 technique. Execution has 1 technique. Persistence has 4 techniques. Privilege escalation has 4 techniques. Defense evasion has 4 techniques. Credential access has 8 techniques. Discovery has 4 techniques. And impact has 2 techniques. There are no techniques for lateral movement, collection, or exfiltration. Similar to Office 365, it is a rather small matrix compared to the generic cloud one and others. From looking at the matrix, you see some similar techniques, such as valid accounts and account manipulation. One interesting note is that while there are similar techniques, there are different sub-techniques listed. For example, account manipulation on Office 365 has 2 sub-techniques, whereas account manipulation has 3 sub-techniques on the Azure AD matrix. One technique that we'll take a closer look at on this matrix is endpoint denial of service in the impact tactic, which has 4 sub-techniques. 1. Operating system exhaustion flood. This occurs when a vulnerability in the operating system is exploited to the point that it overwhelms the operating system's resources, causing it to crash and become unusable for other users. 2. Service exhaustion flood. This is when a software vulnerability in the service is exploited to the point that it causes the service to crash and become unusable for other users. 3. Application exhaustion flood. This is when a software vulnerability in the application is exploited to the point that it causes the application to crash and become unusable for other users. 4. Application or system exploitation. This is when a software vulnerability in the application or system is exploited to the point that it causes the application or system to crash and become unusable for other users. Endpoint denial of service, at its core, is any time that a service, system, or application is exploited to the point that it no longer is responsive and crashes, causing an outage for other users. Common examples of this are HTTP floods, SYN floods, and distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks. Denial of service and DDoS attacks are very common because they can be easily executed. One procedural example is of the Sandworm team, a Russian threat group that was able to execute an attack against the government of the country of Georgia and cause an outage in 2019. There are also multiple open source tools and scripts that can be used to execute denial of service and DDoS attacks. Some mitigation steps are through implementing firewall rules for rate limiting, implementing load balancing where possible, and leveraging features from content delivery networks, or CDNs, that specialize in denial of service and DDoS mitigations. For detection, you can analyze traffic patterns looking specifically for large numbers of denials, or those from a specific header, and in general, analyzing data for unusual or unexpected spikes. Next, we'll take a look at the framework for Google Workspaces. Google Workspaces. A non-Microsoft product and one that is gaining traction as an option for replacing traditional endpoints is Google Workspaces. Google Workspaces currently has over 3 billion users and is continuing to grow. The matrix for Google Workspaces looks like this. Initial access has 2 techniques. Execution has 1 technique. Persistence has 4 techniques. Privilege escalation has 3 techniques. Defense evasion has 6 techniques. Credential access has 7 techniques. Discovery has 4 techniques. Lateral movement has 2 techniques. Collection has 3 techniques. Exfiltration has 3 techniques. And impact has 3 techniques. This is a larger matrix than both Office 365 and Azure AD because Google Workspaces work like virtual endpoints and carry out more functions than Office 365 and Azure AD. One of the techniques worth digging into is use alternate authentication material in the defense evasion tactic, which has 4 sub-techniques. 1. Application access token. This is a form of multi-factor authentication that makes an API call on behalf of the user to authenticate. Common access tokens are through Duo and Microsoft Authenticator. 2. Pass the hash. This technique involves capturing the hash of a user's password, which is then used to authenticate as that user without needing the actual password. This method exploits weaknesses in authentication protocols, allowing attackers to gain unauthorized access to systems by reusing existing credentials. 3. Pass the ticket. Similar to pass the hash, this method involves stealing a user's authentication ticket and reusing it to gain unauthorized access. It exploits vulnerabilities in ticket-based authentication systems to impersonate a user, gaining access to network resources without requiring the user's actual credentials. 4. Web session cookie. These are server-side files that contain user data that could be anything from authentication to browsing data and are cleared when a user session is over, such as logging out or exiting a program. Multi-factor authentication in general is extremely common, and if it's not implemented in your environment, we strongly suggest that you do so. Multi-factor authentication combines something you know, like a password, with something you have, like a physical device or software token. Physical devices might include RSA tokens or YubiKeys, when software options could be apps like Google Authenticator or Duo. These tools fulfill the something you have requirement of multi-factor authentication. Attackers will try to compromise multi-factor authentication by sending multiple pushes for a compromised password in hopes that an end user accepts it. The attacker will then have access to the account and might be able to move laterally within the organization to carry out their actions on objectives. There have been multiple cases in which multi-factor authentication has been hijacked, one of which is by ATT&CK, a Russian APT group that commonly compromises security assertion markup language, a form of web authentication tokens. Another use case is the Uber compromise of 2022, which started from an attacker spamming an end user with authentication pushes that the end user eventually accepted. The attacker was then able to execute scripts to escalate their privilege and complete a full compromise of Uber. Some steps that can be taken for mitigation are to limit credential overlaps across systems, which means requiring users to have multiple sets of credentials that can mitigate lateral movement, as well as implement the principle of least privilege. This means only giving users the level of access that they absolutely need to conduct their job, limiting who has admin privileges. Next, we'll cover another form of cloud service, software as a service. Software as a service. Another form of cloud service is software as a service. Software as a service is when applications are cloud-based, and it's becoming more and more common for application offerings to provide software as a service versions. The software as a service matrix looks like this. Initial access has 4 techniques. Execution has 2 techniques. Persistence has 5 techniques. Privilege escalation has 4 techniques. Defense evasion has 6 techniques. Credential access has 7 techniques. Discovery has 4 techniques. Lateral movement has 4 techniques. Collection has 3 techniques. Exfiltration has 3 techniques. And impact has 4 techniques. The software as a service model usually provides flexibility in the scalability of an application, in uptime, and ideally lower overhead with the management of the software as a service applications. Out of this matrix, we'll take a deeper look at the data from information repositories technique from the collection tactic, which has 3 sub-techniques. 1. Confluence. This is a collaboration space bought by Atlassian, used for information sharing and creating team spaces. It is typically a central repository for creating organizational processes and storing information. 2. SharePoint. Developed by Microsoft, SharePoint is an enterprise information portal that can be configured to run intranet, extranet, and internet sites. It is a platform for managing and provisioning intranet portals, group workspaces, documents, lists, and centralized data storage. SharePoint is designed to integrate with Microsoft Office and is used primarily for document management and collaboration, allowing teams to work together securely, streamline data management, and enhance productivity across the organization. 3. Code repositories. These are archives of code that is actively being worked on. A notable code repository tool is GitHub, where developers have the ability to pull down code, submit new code, and run code to test it. Information repositories are commonly targeted by attackers that are looking to exfiltrate data, looking for credentials that might be shared within repositories or other pertinent information, such as client lists or system data. It's very common to see teams share company-sensitive data on Confluence pages or to see passwords or keys hard-coded into the program in the repositories. There are a number of attackers that have targeted information repositories as part of their attacks, but some of the notable ones are APT&CK, a Russian APT group, and Foxkitten, a hacker group attributed to Iran. Some steps that can be taken to mitigate the risk of information repositories is to set up secure coding practices requiring that developers do not hard code in any passwords or keys. Another step is to audit all code and information repositories to review for shared confidential information. A different step is to implement monitoring to detect these actions by reviewing application logs and third-party access to the information. Another step would be to implement monitoring on login sessions and what pages users attempt to access, especially in cases where they might not have permission to do so. Next, we'll discuss another form of cloud services, infrastructure as a service. Infrastructure as a service. There is also the growing popularity of infrastructure as a service. Infrastructure as a service is a form of cloud computing that offers computing power, network resources, and storage on demand. It is growing in popularity due to the ease of scalability in setting up failover sites. Common examples of infrastructure as a service are VirtualBox, AWS, Azure, and DigitalOcean. The infrastructure as a service matrix looks like this. Initial access has 3 techniques. Execution has 4 techniques. Persistence has 6 techniques. Privilege escalation has 4 techniques. Defense evasion has 8 techniques. Credential access has 7 techniques. Discovery has 14 techniques. Lateral movement has 2 techniques. Collection has 4 techniques. Exfiltration has 2 techniques. And impact has 7 techniques. As you can see, it is the largest of the specialized cloud matrices. One technique that we'll take a closer look at is modified cloud compute infrastructure in the defense evasion tactic, which has 5 sub-techniques. 1. Create snapshot. Snapshots are point-in-time copies of data. They are used heavily in disaster recovery planning and backups in general. An attacker might create a snapshot to bypass restrictions or to add new rules, such as making network changes to allow SSH traffic. 2. Create cloud instance. These are virtual server instances, and an attacker might create a cloud instance to bypass firewall rules or permissions. 3. Delete cloud instance. This is where a virtual server is removed. An attacker might delete a cloud instance in an effort to cover their tracks by removing forensic information. 4. Revert cloud instance. This is to go back to an earlier state in that instance. An attacker might want to do this to help evade detection after conducting malicious actions or to remove evidence. 5. Modify cloud compute configurations. This involves changing the settings of cloud computing resources. An attacker might modify these configurations to escalate privileges, expand their access within the network, or alter computing resources to better suit malicious purposes. This technique was chosen because it only appears on the infrastructure as a service and overarching cloud boards, as it is different from any other cloud matrix. An attacker might modify cloud compute infrastructure in the form of adding or removing virtual servers or instances, enabling or disabling services, and so on. These actions are typically conducted in an attempt to bypass permission or other restrictions or to use as a pivot point, because once a malicious action is conducted, an attacker can easily remove the instance to cover up their tracks. The thing with infrastructure as a service is that as cloud infrastructure becomes more popular, these types of attacks will continue to occur more frequently. A large number of APT groups have used cloud infrastructure in their compromises. This is actually one of the harder techniques to mitigate because it's based on the abuse of a normal action. The main steps that you can take are to ensure that proper privileges are in place to restrict who can stand up and spin down cloud resources and restrict any pages that have confidential data. These steps in and of themselves can be laborious and sometimes detrimental to fast-moving teams. So this is a case where you would want to rely more on detection. Some detection steps can be to establish logging, for instance, start, stop, and modification. For example, in our organization, we have alerts that are configured to trigger when an instance is spun up with increased permissions so that we can investigate. Even though this type of action is typically done as an oversight, it's good to have a trust but verify mindset. We have now taken a deeper look at all of the cloud-related matrices that are currently available for the MITRE ATT&CK framework. There are differences in each matrix, and this is a great instance of having to choose the correct one and the applicable techniques and sub-techniques to monitor and cover in your environment. It's also important to understand what you should be monitoring for detection and mitigation as more and more environments transition to either hybrid or full cloud environments. In the next section, we'll cover the Windows Framework Matrix.